Hello, everyone, and welcome to the June 2021 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club podcast. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. The PCRF promotes research literacy to advance the science of EMS educational research. So here with the PCRF Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in medical education. And actually today is in an education environment, not specifically medical education, but I think you'll enjoy this study. I think it has some great relevance to some of the students that we work with. I'm Megan Corey, and I'm joined by Katie O'Connor, Dave Page, who's at an international conference, maybe popping in and out while doing multiple things. And we're certainly going to be joined by Dr. Bill Toon once he's done with his retirement workout, which we can give him some digs for. But the study we're going to be reviewing today, I think you're really going to enjoy. If you haven't read this yet, it is behind a paywall. So if you need some access, this is a great article. It's called Effort Praise Improves Resilience for College Students with a High Fear of Failure. This was published in 2021 in an interesting journal, a Journal of College Students Retention, Research Theory and Practice. Now, but first, before we go into this study, I want to give you the last call for abstracts. So each year, the call for abstracts highlights the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum activities. As you know, abstracts are received from EMS providers, clinicians, educators, researchers, and students from all over the nation and abroad. And we use a peer-reviewed process, blinded, and determines which authors are invited to present their study, poster presentation, oral presentation at a national conference, and sometimes even at an international conference. The call for abstracts, educational, clinical, and systems abstracts are all together, and that's date is in 5 days. So June 30th, 2021, 5 days from now, you have that, if you have even preliminary data to get together an abstract, and then you can continue your research to present, if you've got something together, you've got 5 days to get it together. Submit your abstract online. And for more information, you can email pcrf@mednet.ucla.edu, or just go to prehospitalcare.org and you can check out the call for abstracts, the details, and then how you submit the abstract. So thank you all for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and begin. And we want to remind the listeners that you can use your chat feature on your screen to type in questions, comments. We'd love to bring that into the conversation as we go. And I know there's other educators out there. I think Dave was reading me the list of people that were logged in. I know Ron Lawler, you're out there, educator extraordinaire. There's some people out there who are educators. Feel free if you have some experience in this regard, or if you have some comments, you can unmute, or we can get you unmuted. Or you can just type in your comments and questions and we'll bring them in. So a little background on this: the National Center for Education Statistics, the authors actually bring up these statistics. I'm sure many people are familiar with this, but they show that significant dropout rates for first-time, full-time undergraduate students. And this is actually, I've always thought of this as a national issue, but the authors point out that it's international. And the national data from our National Center for Education Statistics in 2019, which means the data is lagging, maybe around 2010, 41% of students, those first-time, full-time undergrad students, complete their bachelor's degree in 4 years, 60% in 6 years. We also know from other research that students who drop out earn less income per year. Never mind the burden of those 6-year students that they've taken on with student loans, and those who drop out with carrying student loan debt. We've talked about that on this podcast before. So we know that this is an issue, and that's led institutions to focus heavily on student services that might promote retention and completion. Now, the authors propose that not enough attention has gone into the role of the psychological state of the student as they come in. So what kind of baggage is the student bringing in? In particular, they point out, where are they on their fear of failure spectrum? So, do they have a high fear of failure, an average, or a low fear of failure? That's something that they throw into this as they design their study. And then what's the effect of that psychological state on retention and completion when given different challenging coursework in that first year in particular, and even the second year? Now, growth mindset research, I'm sure all of you educators out there are very familiar, and if you're even just a popular, if you read a lot of the popular literature on education, you might be familiar with growth mindset research, Carol Dweck and others. That's been around for a little more than a decade. And that points to that kind of creates this false dichotomy. But when you think about it, there's essentially, they group it into two camps. You have individuals that have a fixed mindset, who believe that intelligence is inherent and can't be changed, versus a growth mindset where you might believe that intelligence is capable of being changed. Now, the research points to the resiliency of those with a growth mindset. So people with a growth mindset tend to be more resilient and accept challenging tasks. Furthermore, they examined the effects of feedback, meaning critique and praise, on performance, and most of this research has been in children. And again, Dweck and others led this research, examining the effects of the types of feedback on the performance. And again, most of this in children, some of it in adults, and grouped this type of praise into two types. One was ability praise, where the praise would be worded in a way that would suggest that the student was just naturally smart or intelligent. You're so smart at this. Great job. You're very smart. Versus effort praise. You've worked really hard, and that's why you've achieved your result. So again, grouping that into that sort of growth mindset with the effort praise versus a fixed mindset with the ability praise. So these experiments were pretty classic, and they were in three phases. So you would have, essentially the way they would test resilience was they would have a simple test, say a word association test or something like that, and not necessarily simple, something that was sort of average ability, that was timed. Students would take this test, then they would receive the two different types of praise. So you'd have the groups would go into two different groups, two different experimental groups. One group would receive effort praise, the other would receive ability praise. And then they would follow that up with a test in a second phase that was designed for failure. So knowing that the students would fail, and follow that up with, well, you did worse on this. And then after that, in the third phase, follow this statement about doing worse with a test that was essentially the same as the first phase. So it was three phases. And that phase 2 to phase 3, where you have the test that's designed to make you fail versus the test, that again is equivalent to the first phase, that's designed to test resilience. So that's a standard test, and that's been used to study children and resilience and the type of feedback. And what was shown several times with repetition is that significant increase in performance on the final set of problems, meaning the test of resilience, was shown with effort and students who received effort praise. And that's been repeated in children. There was mixed results in adults. This, again, that very same type of three-phased approach was demonstrated in adults, but there was with mixed results. You had some where you saw the effort praise was better than ability praise. You saw a lot of times with it just coming out evenly. And then there was some question as to the design. With adults, it's very difficult to design praise that appears authentic. And that was one of the things that came up in some of the prior studies about retention and resilience in adults is, maybe the adults don't really buy into this praise. So the authors wanted to explore then, just taking all of this background, they really wanted to explore how feedback, and that praise feedback in particular, is going to interact with personality characteristics, in particular, fear of failure. So what they're saying is maybe we haven't been looking at this right in the adults. Maybe we need to look at the psychological state of the student, in particular, those with a high fear of failure, and the impact that effort praise and ability praise might have on students based upon their personality characteristics, if that makes sense. I'm trying to explain this because I'm setting the stage for what they're going to do. They're going to replicate a study that has been an experiment that's been done in kids and adults, but they're adding a layer to it. They're adding this idea that the psychological state might matter, and in particular, their psychological state related to the fear of failure. They want to see if, again, those types of praise promotes resilience better than others. So their hypothesis, and they're going to be in university students that are freshmen and sophomores, their hypothesis then is that adults participants with a high fear of failure will perform better in that last series of problems. I'm actually going to put up the design of the study here so you can see this. Those of you who have a screen, you're seeing the experiments, and we'll go through this. I'm going to leave this up and go back and forth between the results, and we'll bring Katie, who can in to talk about some of these results as well. So the adult participants, this is their hypothesis, adult participants with high fear of failure will perform better in the last of a series of problem sets, so the one that's designed to promote resilience, when they're given effort praise rather than ability praise. And then their second part of their hypothesis is that adult participants with a low fear of failure will show no difference in the performance on that third set of problems, whether they're given effort or ability praise. So these were they ended up doing this in two separate experiments, although I don't think they really planned to. I think that was kind of something that came up in experiment 1 that they didn't anticipate, that led them to experiment 2. So let's look at this chart here. So there's a few tests that they have. In experiment 1, if you look at the top part of this, just look at experiment 1. In experiment 1, they first administered to the students the Performance Failure Appraisal Inventory, or PFAI. So this is a short form Likert scale test or a series of questions that measures their fear of failure. It's a 5-item validated test, that Performance Failure Appraisal Inventory. And so they were able to group students into whether they had a low fear of failure, an average fear of failure, or a high fear of failure. So now these students will enter into this experiment. The participants in the experiment, by the way, in this first experiment, they asked 180 participants, but after a series of exclusions, either they didn't meet or didn't complete the experiment, which 33 of them didn't complete it, or 12 of them requested to be excluded. 24 had done it before, which is interesting, and then 6 of them had met both of those exclusion criteria, and actually they had a few that entered, quote, nonsensical response, which I thought was interesting. I'd love to know what that nonsensical response was. But after removing all of them, you had 100 people, so 100 study subjects in this first experiment. And the experiment they used, the intervention you can see, or the test, sorry, not the intervention. The intervention is going to be the praise. The test that they used, that you see in the phase 1 column, is called the RAT test, which is kind of a funny name, but it's the Remote Associates Triad Problems. So this is problems where you have 3 words that are presented simultaneously, and then the participants are instructed to find the 4th related word that connects them. So they use the example in their article of If you're given the 3 words sore, shoulder, and sweat, then you come up with that 4th word, and that 4th word is cold. So cold, sore, cold shoulder, cold sweat. So you have to generate that word, though. There's not a list that you select from. So they use these BRAT problems, and they mix them up. Some are easy to solve, a couple are difficult, and 8 are impossible. So no known solution. So when you look at this, phase 2 is going to be the test where you put all the impossibles and a couple of difficults in here. Phase 1 is your average test. These are timed as well. So the students, this is all electronic, including the praise, by the way. So the student will take this test. They have 30 seconds, I believe, for each item at the most to come up with that 4th word. Then at the end of the test, the timed test, they get each of these students is grouped into an intervention group. They either get effort praise, which is again electronic, and that effort praise, as you can see, says you must have really worked hard on these problems. You solved more problems correctly than most people. Or they're grouped into the ability praise. You must be naturally gifted at these kinds of problems. You solved more problems correctly than most people. Or no praise, which just says, please click the button below to proceed to the next set of problems. And then phase 2 is the next set of problems, and this is the one that's designed to fail. So you have 8 impossibles and a couple of difficult items. And right after phase 2, it's not shown in their table, but after phase 2, they do get also electronic feedback that says your performance was much worse on these problems. I don't know why they didn't put that in this table. I thought that was kind of important because they didn't just go from phase 2 to phase 3. They actually got a cue that said your performance was much worse on these problems, and they progressed to the next set of problems. And then phase 3, those problems were different than the ones in phase 1, but equivalent in difficulty level. So the intervention here is right in the center, the praise, the failure, and then the feedback that says this was much worse. And then do they bounce back and perform as they did in phase 1 or better, based upon the praise that they got. And that's what they were looking at, was the interaction between these types of praises. And what's not shown in here that you'll see in the results is how does this matter depending upon the psychological state of the student in terms of how they were characterized on that fear of failure test. If they had a high fear of failure, average fear of failure, or a low fear of failure. So Katie, did I, as somebody who's just coming in, we just kind of pulled you in because we know you have a lot of experience with, with students directly in classroom and skills lab settings and in simulation settings, which I think this, eventually we're going to relate this to this. Did I explain that pretty well? I mean, can you kind of picture the experiment?
Yeah, I definitely can. And it's hitting all of the things that we talk about as educators, right? Like, I think when they're saying that we had to change the experiment because it was too hard and no one even wanted to try, I'm like, yeah. that makes perfect sense. I, as a person, wouldn't want to try something that's hard. And I don't think I have a big fear of failure as they're studying in this, but clearly if there's a mountain that you can't climb, I think of it from an educator perspective, they weren't even given the tools to climb it, right? Like they didn't have a tutorial and info session trials. So it all just makes sense from what we think about as educators.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to bounce back and forth here. So let me just go forward, then I'm going to come back to experiment 2. And what Katie is saying is, when we look then at the results from experiment 1, so again, this makes me say that they tried this experiment and went, whoa, what did we do to these poor students? And then regrouped, went to a different set of students and created experiment 2 with some changes, which we'll go through what those changes are. But essentially what happened here, if you look at the on the y-axis here, you have performance. You can see that, first of all, the performance is low to begin with, even in phase 1. So the lines are going from left to right, phase 1 to phase 3. And you have these grouped into, so the top part of this is experiment 1. The categories or the psychological state of the student is seen also as average on the left side, high is in the middle panel there, and low is to the right. And then you have 3 lines, graphs here. And if you look at the legend, those 3 are the types of praise that were implemented here. So ability is very faint with the circle, and effort is the triangle, and no praise is the darkest line with the squares. So if you just look across experiment 1, the first thing that stands out is not only are the initial scores pretty low, but the scores between phase 1 and phase 3 just plummet, which, and no matter who it was taking the test, whether they had an average, high, or low fear of failure, which said they just gave up. I mean, they just went, forget this, I just not even going to try, which is something we've seen in when students are given an impossible or a very challenging task. And in particular, if they have a high fear of failure, they simply give up. So that's what they were very surprised at this and said, okay, let's back up and let's change the experiment. So they went back and they wanted to repeat the experiment, but they wanted to make some adjustments based upon that first experiment. And again, these are just a reminder, they're all done online. This is electronic. So the changes that they made in between experiment 1 and experiment 2 is, number 1, you can see already there are fewer problems. So we can see fewer problems. They use a different type of test, one that is simpler. And this is called a word fragments test, or I would call it Wheel of Fortune. That's what it looks like to me, as the Wheel of Fortune test, where you have a certain number of letters that are there and some missing, and you have to come up with the solution, which is fill in, what word is this? There were fewer problems, and then the timing was changed. So they reduced the timing because they felt that this would be a simpler test, which I would agree with them. This is a simpler test, and they reduced the timing. I think it went from 10 to 30 seconds before for each item to 5 to 10 seconds. They also changed, interestingly, the language of the praise, because they also felt that the authenticity was not there in that first, the terminology of the first group of text for the praise. So they added something that's a little bit more scientific. And if you notice in the effort praise, it says you solved more than 50% of the word fragments. This indicates that you worked harder than most on these problems. They wanted it to sound believable and authentic. And then the ability praise is you solved more than 50% of the word fragments. This indicates that your natural aptitude is above average for these problems. And then the no praise, please click on the button. Same no praise, just advance it forward. And then in phase 2, they did the same thing. They had no, you can't, just, these aren't even words, so you can't solve them. And so it would take a lot of effort, and they're designed to fail. But in phase, they also added a questionnaire, and I believe they added the questionnaire at the very end, but that wasn't clear to me. They did get the feedback, your performance was much worse on these problems between phase 2 and phase 3. And then phase 3 returns to the same level of difficulty as phase 1, but different items, and they solved those. And they measured, again, that's the test of resilience. But they did add in experiment 2, 3 new questions to assess work ethic and effort, and I'll show you that questionnaire in just a second. But students were able to answer, and that's how they could figure out whether they believed the praise, whether it felt like it was authentic or not, and whether they, how they interacted. So it was a student perception scale. So now let's look at the results of experiment 2. So now we're looking at the bottom of the screen in figure 2, and we're looking at the average fear of failure group, again on the left, the high fear of failure group in the middle, and the low fear of failure group on the right. And what we're seeing here now, looking at the different types of praise, is no significant difference really between the no praise and the effort praise and the ability praise in the average and low group. But in the high fear of failure group, we're seeing a significant difference in those who got ability praise and their scores between phase 1 and phase 3. But interestingly, across the board, if you look at the difference between the phase 1 and phase 3 scores, you can automatically see that the second test, was definitely different. It wasn't more difficult. It wasn't so difficult that students gave up. So it might have been calibrated a little bit better to get at what they were really trying to look at, which was, does the praise make a difference depending upon the psychological characteristics of the student? And of course, like we say, every research has its limitations. This is a very kind of lab type of study. It doesn't reflect real college work. These are word problems, not college work, but there's so much that we can talk about related to EMS here. And my wheels were spinning reading this kind of stuff, when it comes to students that have different, psychological states when they're coming into our programs. So Katie, what did you think of this? What did you think of this this experiment 2?
Yeah, I'm with you on this. We're total wheels spinning over here. I liked that they did something that didn't immediately shut everyone down. So that was really interesting. I mean, you could totally see here how people continued. When we think about resiliency, I know that's like a buzzword right now, and how you build resiliency. I think that's just a key takeaway too, right? Like the idea of scaffolding here seemed to work so much better for them. But it really is the people with high fear of failure. There was that line is so straight up and down almost compared to the other ones with the effort praise. It kind of makes sense, right? When you think of like ability, that's not really growth mindset. And then effort is you can work harder. So if hard work is getting you the result, it would make sense that it would motivate you to just work more because that's what's giving you the results. I do find it a little strange that they wanted it to be authentic by saying you got 50% of it right, because I'm wondering if that was the praise for everyone, even if they didn't get 50% of it right, because I would think that might cause people to stop and be like, it didn't seem like that. It only seemed like I got 1 right out of 4. That's not 50%, but I'm not sure,
They actually did come up with that. And this is table 1, which is that influence of praise on effort and attitude. And they mentioned this in the article, like, this is a standard feedback. And if they didn't get a certain score, and that's what happened, I think, in experiment 1, is they weren't, you get praise. And it was like, why are you praising me? I missed 60% of these items. So I think, did I even believe it? And I think if you look at the 3 questions, one is, how did you characterize your own efforts? So that was work ethic. Did failing to solve problems influence your attitude? So this was done at the end. And then did the feedback presented to you earlier influence how you approach a problem? So this was like, it didn't feel like, it was even accurate versus, it motivated me to keep going. So, which is interesting. I mean, look at like the spread there. And then in the difference in the praises, there really isn't much, when you see, the different types of praise. So yeah, I just thought this was, and actually I see Eric Chase is writing as well. We're using improv to improve creativity, listening, failure, feedback, and left-right brain integration. Yeah, the whole world of feedback and then student reflection. I think that there's so much there. There's so much to think about there. But I don't know what you were thinking during this whole thing, Katie, but every time I looked at something like this or I read, I kept thinking, how many times have I made too much of a challenging task? And I've seen it on the student's face. I thought, this scenario is too challenging at this point. But I didn't think, what impact might that have on the student as they go forward? And how do I help them come back and say, it's okay to fail that? That might have been my error to push you too much into that into that level of simulation, something like that.
Yeah, I think about it a lot, and it's one of the areas I think that our colleagues in healthcare, especially in like nursing and medicine, they've really brought in the idea of pre-briefing as just such an important part of the simulation process. And I think that really speaks to this, right? Like the idea of pre-briefing is what can the mannequin do, right? Like you meet the mannequin, find the pulse points, listen to the lung sounds, because it's all mechanical and computerized, and it's, as much as we want to pretend it's real, it's not. So that even if we don't do those kinds of good steps of setting a safe learning environment where people feel like they can, to some degree, fail, but also that they're not having an impossible task, right? If you don't even know where to listen on the mannequin for lung sounds, how could you be expected to hear what they actually are,
Yeah, and I think about that a lot too. This is a very critical time. The national education standards are going to be coming out, and in them, at least in the draft versions, I'm sure that continues, there's a heavy emphasis on moving away from our traditional, a stick an IV in a rubber mannequin type of skills and integrating them into scenario-based and larger simulation-based learning. Then we also have the documents that have come out from the COA EMSP that discuss in detail the levels, or suggest that there's levels of learning and testing in simulation, right? So we talk about this a lot. So it's not going to be enough to just say to educators, all right, now you need to move away from these rote individual come in, rubber mannequin, do an intubation, move to the next station and do this, and get them into simulation without some guidance on what that might do to the student in terms of their ability to move forward and improve. So if we just sort of go out there and say, all right, we need to move to simulation-based learning without some training and guidance and research to, and some discussion about the evidence that, like you were saying, comes from nursing and medicine about not just the cognitive load, but the psychological load on the students and how that impacts their ability to improve and their resilience. I think that's, we can really be setting things up in the wrong way if we don't do this carefully. There's a document, I think, Pat Tritt and I were talking about it, and we're reading about it, and we talked about it in the progression of learning. It's in there, the document on progression of learning, where there's, and I know Dennis Edgerly has presented on this for many years, suggesting that you have skills, you have scenarios that are more targeted, that have specific objectives, that have very little extra things in them, and then you have simulations. But I would also say there's levels of simulation too, where you have, sort of and again, they have to be, blueprinted and clearly outlined and objective based, and then they have to be tailored to what the student needs too. And they can't just be sort of, okay, we're going to have an 80-year-old sepsis. You may have an 80-year-old sepsis scenario that is level 1, which is pretty obvious, where you have good history and you have very few other distractors in there. And then you may have increasing levels of difficulty that end with things like interprofessional elements and safety issues on scene and language differences. So, I think this is a really important time to start talking about this kind of stuff because of things like this, because of the impact it might have on students that have a high fear of failure or high psychological impact.
Yeah, I think so. And, when I was first starting and still see it today, I mean, I know more about simulation now, so I don't make the same mistakes I made, but it was, hey, did you have a good call, or do you remember a patient? Just make up the patient that you had in the ambulance and give that to the students. And there wasn't, a lot of direction from the program directors or from the people that were coordinating the skills when I was first teaching. And when I was first doing those things, I wasn't coordinating them either. I was like, yeah, just give them a diabetic case, whatever. You're a paramedic, you know what a diabetic presents like. But as you're saying, there's so much difficulty in even just, is this a clear-cut diabetic patient? Or is it a borderline? I mean, that's going to increase the difficulty and challenge for the paramedic student for sure. But also things that we don't even think about, like when we're just I would say phoning it in, but doing make-believe where you have just a mannequin on the ground and you're like, yeah, he's got an laceration to the head. The level of difficulty for the student could be one of the impossible tasks like we saw in this experiment 1, because just saying a laceration to the head, is it, 2 inches, 4 inches? Is it deep? Where is the blood looking like? Is it got, dirt or something in it that needs to be decontaminated? There's so many questions to that in a real world environment, we would just be able to see and we would immediately process such depths of information. But when we make believe, it almost is like setting them up in experiment 1 to be impossible because they don't have any of that information that's critical to their decisions.
Yeah, and that's part of that whole pre-briefing that you're talking about. Do we have Bill Toon on? I know Bill was coming in. I don't know.
I've been listening to you all along, and you always seem to pick papers that like I'm the example child of and stuff. I wish you'd stop doing that because it really is depressing for me. It doesn't pick up my spirits
which
at all.
example are you? In the student group or in the instructor group?
I'm gonna let you figure that out at some point. So, no, first of all, this is a little praise for you. You really present this so it's very clear that even as I was driving in the car, I was able to mentally put the picture together of what this experiment was and what they were trying to achieve in that. And that's very helpful. I was not aware of the fear scale that they talked about, and beginning to think, well, what are some of the tools that we as instructors can use to get to understand our students earlier on? Because sometimes not sometimes. My experience has been is it will take almost, in a 3-semester paramedic program, it will take almost the entire first semester to really find out how your students tick. And then the next 2 semesters after that are relatively, easier because you understand so much more about the students. And it would be nice if we knew more right from the beginning with them, so we may be able to make sure that the environment that they're working is conducive for their learning.
I couldn't agree more. And I think if Dave is still on, I would love to also at some point talk about, that's one of the things I wrote down here too, was are there things that we should be measuring on entry to evaluate? And I know that there's been research, I know at the FISDAP Research Summit, there research on things like neuroticism and personality kind of features of students and their performance. But I'm wondering, this scale, I'm curious about this scale, and if anyone has done this, and what other types of things do program directors do or instructors do to assess the baseline of their students as they come in, and not just their ability to perform math functions, which is important, but also their psychological state. How can we evaluate the psychological state? Dave, are you happen to be here?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
I'm multitasking today with multiple webinars and conferences, and so thank you. And I do think thanks for the shout out for the research that's been done trying to identify characteristics of candidates or entering paramedic students to see, if grit, resilience, the ability to kind of stick with it is maybe something that is measurable. I know Professor Brett Williams has done some work around the empathy scales to see, and they actually go down when people are in paramedic school. They get less empathetic, which is kind of scary. But the concept here that I had a hard time with this article. I'm not the kind of guy that thinks everybody should get a trophy, and I am a believer in that NEMSI, sort of balanced sandwich type feedback where, you talk about good stuff and then, stuff to improve, and then end with some positive comments, because I do think it is building resilience. I just don't think that empty praise, the in quotes, good job really works. But you know, the math ability, as you said, just measuring your ability to do science is correlated to higher achievement. So your ability to do, you know, inference or scientific method, or in some way, not just math, but also biology, you know, the anatomy and physiology courses may actually do more than just teach people anatomy and physiology. They're just giving you a sense and a background on what science is. But I do have to say, you know, Peter Saffer and Freedom House Ambulance proved that you don't really need to be the greatest at reading and writing to be a paramedic. And I think it's dangerous to attach reading levels to that inference that common sense or critical thinking comes from education. I actually think you can learn that on the street, and that bias may actually be systemic racism in disguise about how we sort of decide, well, you do or don't have the tools. And in that context, just being involved in a world where you're constantly being criticized or constantly being told you're not good enough or you won't amount to anything, you have that confirmation bias when you fail. Instead of being resilient, you're told, you know, see there again, that's another example of failure, and therefore, you know, the resilience is gone. So I do think that it's part of a bigger picture of who's got cheerleaders behind them saying, good job, good job, good job. And for those educators that are designing online modules or educational programs that kind of need to do some of that as sort of a cookie crumbs or little rewards for our students to feel empowered as they go. You know, give them the CPR card as they achieve, you know, small milestones, small goals. And I don't know, it's like Pokemon. You get more and more badges, you get more and more, you know, rare Pokemons, and you suddenly, you know, become better at chasing after the harder ones, right? So.
Well, I think you hit on something though too. I mean, and it goes through it in the preceptor course on PhysDep and in other preceptor courses, which is how to provide feedback. You know, there's scientific specific feedback. I mean, students, you can say good job all you want, or you can say something very generic like you need to get more organized on your assessments. But without a specific example of where they did well and what you want to see more of, and where they're deficient or they need more improvement in an assessment based upon either a simulation or and even a videotaped one where you can point to it and say, see here, this is what you did. I'd like to see more of that. See that piece, that was really good or that was not. That, or in a clinical setting, that specific feedback, it does fall short. It's platitudes, right? And so it's scientific kind of feedback. They want that specific. That's why I liked the second, that when they adjusted their feedback and said, you achieved more than 50%, as long as it's authentic. Like Katie said, if it isn't authentic, then you got a problem.
And in the study design, I thought, you know, this paper does a really good job of saying it's sort of, if you dump people into the deep end of the pool and just say swim, you have a, you know, just to mix and match analogies, you have a deer in the headlights kind of overwhelming. I can't,
totally
you know,
done that.
I can't find my way through this forest. So I do think, you know, both the portfolio and the SMC or Appendix G or whatever you want to call it, there was a concept of these simple scenarios building, right? And I think we all do it. It's sort of like in simulation, we're going to measure your ability to do certain building blocks, then combine those building blocks and make them bigger and bigger and bigger until you have a very complex Lego set that, you know, if you would have told me I'm going to build the Starship Enterprise when I started, I would have said, I don't even know where to start. But, you know, you build the pieces to it, you start to look at the parts, and then you feel like, oh, look, I have competency here, here, and here. And the more you internalize those blocks, the more they're transferable. I thought they did a nice job of talking about that. So I think the transference of that resilience from one block to another. I feel like we see that every day when people complete EMT classes and they suddenly go on to medical school. It makes us very sad, but in some way, these smart kids that may have had low confidence that they could achieve more or different goals get empowered when they succeed at some of these, the worst possible situation you could have is somebody dying, and here you are treating them, helping them, and an EMT class gives you that sort of sense of what's the worst that can happen. I'm going to open their airway, I'm going to do some breathing, and if that's the only thing I get done, and chest compressions, that's the only thing I got done. So we teach them those sort of resilience building blocks, and then we hopefully give them good feedback if we're not overly critical in areas that really didn't matter.
Yeah. Earlier you said you were talking, and you and Bill were talking about these, what tests could we do as students come in, and you mentioned we got to be careful about how we handle this, and I would ask then, entry criteria versus baseline assessment. So I think those have to be distinguished. So if you're using a test to say, okay, these are the people we want, and so we're going to test you on, ability and personality and things like that, and that's where I can see there might be, an issue, versus we've already accepted you into the program. Now we just want to see where you're at so we can target services, be aware of, things that we can do that are, evidence-based, that will promote resilience, retention, completion.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
I'm very curious about, excuse me, this concept of this fear of failure that they talk about in this paper, because if you have fear, you have emotion. If you have emotion and you're afraid, then you have engagement. So I think particularly if we're talking about diverse cultures or cultures in which students that might have been communicated with for a long time that they were not good enough, not going to succeed, or that are just not motivated. So, the prisoners that we have, the firefighter who didn't really ever want to do any EMS, but now they're being sent to paramedic school or EMT school. These folks don't have that emotional chip. They've sort of given up, and so this concept of praising effort was really a curious thing for me, because if in fact motivation just means engagement, you have to start with the concept that they might be afraid to fail. I think a lot of students have just taken it for granted they're going to fail. That's part of the disengagement, or just have no interest in the success. I don't really care if I know how to do this. As long as I'm fighting a fire, I'll be happy, and I'll rely on somebody else to do these other things. So I do think that they start from a kind of a place that says there's emotion and desire for success, and therefore the motivation can grow from there. And I feel like it's planting a seed. If there's no seed to begin with, you can water all you want, but there won't be a plant there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point. This was not a diverse population of students. As a matter of fact, I believe it was like 80% white, mostly female, and again, freshman and sophomore undergraduate. I believe it was first-time students. So
yeah, by then you've made it to college. I mean, you've achieved several milestones. Not to mention you've completed high school or done something to show that you had equivalency, and so you're kind of starting a little bit higher in the motivation chain than I think we might be, and I don't know how representative that is of our kids that may or may not had ever envisioned themselves in a uniform.
Yeah, never mind, this was a verbal test, or it said you didn't have to have verbal ability, but these are English language tests, so that's another thing to consider. I would like to pose a question to Bill and Katie. So Bill and Katie, you're an EMS researcher out there, and everybody out there, because we got an abstract deadline coming up, so maybe you can do this between now and then. But all kidding aside, can this be replicated in, and try to envision this, how can this be replicated in an EMS classroom? What level of EMS and what kind of experiment might you implement that could mimic this kind of initial, then a feedback phase, then a design to fail, then a back to that initial resilience test? Design me an experiment.
After you, Katie, ladies first.
I mean, I think you could do it with like multiple choice questions would probably be the easiest and simplest way of doing it, I think, especially, you know, if you're just wanting to replicate the study pretty well. I think if you tried to do it with simulation, you could as well. I mean, there's clearly ways that you could make simulations impossible. I know Heather Davis accuses one of the AMLS, the old AMLS retroperitoneal abscess cases as being an impossible case that no one will ever get. I think a pneumomedius steinum is one that you could give them that there's no way, right? Like it's possible to get. So you could do that, and that would be really interesting. We were doing similar research at UCLA where we were doing, they were wearing fancy, I call them fancy Fitbits, but wrist-worn monitors of physiologic stress indicators, and then doing a cognitive load survey just between different styles of simulation, the make believe, and then here's everything, you can see everything, you can do everything, use the equipment. So that was an interesting similar project. We didn't have any praise built into it though, but we did have what we called a learning session. So the idea of pre-briefing, allowing them to work with the mannequin and giving them more information about the case and how that impacted their ability.
Bill? You're a researcher.
Well, yeah, but I like this. You know, as I said, I liked what they did, and I think you bring up a really the most important point is to do this, you know, in our profession, because there are some differences between the traditional college student and the person that enters EMS profession. It's not that we don't get people already with advanced degrees, you know, undergraduate as well as advanced degrees, but that's not the typical person. And it actually would be interesting to do it at the EMT and the paramedic level. I think it would be important to do it at both to see if there's really any differences. But as I told you, the thing I'm more interested in is I really want to know, I think knowing that fear thing, I want to learn more about that. That's the one I'm interested in, and see how, you know, how we can utilize that as a tool, and something that Dave touched on earlier. And we, you know, I don't want to use knowledge of a student's abilities as a reason to screen them out. I want to use them as a way to know how to help them better. You know, I want to know right at the beginning, if you're scared of tests, how do I help you over that fear? So, and again, I don't want to do something that would end up putting the program saying that we're discriminatory in our practices at all, because I don't think that that's what we want to, that's the kind of position we want to end up in. But if I was to do this, I would do this at the EMT and the paramedic level. I would use, it's very easy, I think, to take a set of questions that the entry-level EMT could answer, and then you could then almost use paramedic level questions as your difficult ones, because they won't have a preference for that, but they would still be sound, you know. But again, as they point out, you don't want to make some test that's not going to, you know, that everyone fails, so they're really down in the dumps on the other end. So that would be very interesting, you know. But again, could we do it? Yes. I'm not sure, and I do believe in praise, because I certainly started early in my career not doing a good job with praise. I think praise is underestimated, but I also agree with Dave that you shouldn't just give praise for the sake of giving praise. You should make sure that it's appropriate and genuine and timely for the situation at hand. And I tell people this all the time. I worked for 10 years in the stockroom of a pottery barn. And there was not a night that I didn't leave there that the manager didn't say specifically to me as I was walking out, we couldn't have gotten everything done tonight without your effort there in the back, you know, in the stock room. And I have to tell you, I appreciated that more than anything else in the world, was getting that because they certainly weren't paying me for it. But the 40% discount was nice.
And it was probably very sincere.
It is profound. I think, you know, just linking back to the moment that someone in a position of either influence or authority says to you, this, you know, today was better because of what you did. And again, the more specific, the better. You know, I think it had an impact on you. And I 100% agree. I don't think measuring ability or even neuroses prior to entry is a screening tool as much as it's a helpful tool. But it does set up that whole bit about bias, right? So the more I know about the kinds of bias that I assume, or the kinds of fears that you have, perhaps, the more I might accidentally be biasing the kind of training that you're getting. And you know, I think there's an abstract coming out. Katie is one of the authors, where without giving too much away, I hope that people participate in the PCRF research forum at EMS World Expo. But you know, just the types of educational experiences that people have may be affected simply by your gender or sex or your skin color. And so we're immediately altering, you know, if you have high neuroses or afraid of exams, we're altering the way we do things. And it may be helpful, but it also may set up a dynamic that is not helpful. I wonder about that unconscious or conscious bias.
I'm just thinking about that too, with the idea behind effort praise, and the idea that if you just, we have a problem already in EMS, and especially like fire-based systems, where you just need to work harder and you'll just get resilience to like just get over it. And we don't talk about the fact that sometimes it doesn't matter how much effort you put into something, like you need help. So I think that that's one thing that we have to be careful with when we do these studies, of saying, oh, just tell them to work harder, or tell them they're a hard worker and they'll just keep working harder. When sometimes, you know, it's not an option. When you have 3 kids at home and a family to take care of, you can't work harder and study more. You have to sleep, you have to eat, and you have to just be a human. And I think paramedic education, at least in my experience, isn't always great at letting people be a human.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
How sad, and how that is so true. It's like we beat the humanity out of them. But you know, sometimes I wonder if that's not intentional. That study on high beam steel beam workers, where they were ruthless at teasing each other on the ground because they needed to be tough when they were on the beam, not panic, and people were, you know, they needed to trust each other in a team. And so some of that dehumanization is maybe necessary in order for people to, under great duress, have to, you know, maintain their cool and do things that we don't expect other humans to do. I wonder how much of that we ignore if we get too touchy-feely, too, you know, good job for the effort, but your patient still died because you really suck at this. You know, I'm just sorry. I guess I should end on that note and run away before somebody shoots at me.
Well, again, it's that it can't be praise for the sake of praise.
Yes.
You know, I just think that praise for the sake of praise lacks, you know, the being genuine. And I think when someone gets older, it's important that it be genuine, and that you give them that example, and it's timely and it's close to the incident and stuff like that. And, you know, what are more appropriate and effective ways to give people the grit they need to do this job, because this job is not an easy job. And I don't think we should ever sell it to anyone that it's easy, or it doesn't have its problems and it doesn't have its challenges. I think that that's when we set people up for failure if they're not really prepared for what the reality of the job is.
Yeah.
And on that note,
yeah. Well, thanks everyone. We are out of time, and we want to thank everyone for joining us. And thank you to Dr. Bill Toon, David Page, Katie O'Connor for joining us. Will to be continued. Great discussion today. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Podcast will be back next month, July 23rd, Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, and we'll have one before then. That's the Clinical Podcast with Dr. Remley Crow, Dr. Tony Fernandez, and others, Monday, July 12th. If you want to present an upcoming article, or if you have one that you suggest we cover, email David Page at dpage@emsed.net. Thank you all. Happy summer.